The morning Maria Whitfield found her front door hanging open and the strongbox on the floor empty. She did not cry. She simply stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, pressed her hand flat against the rough-hewn wood, and felt something cold and final settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. It was the spring of 1882, in the territory of New Mexico, and the land around Copper Creek had been drawing men of fortune and misfortune alike for the better part of a decade. The mountains to the east held silver and copper in their bones, and the flat grasslands that spread out from their feet were fertile enough to raise cattle, wheat, and a particular kind of stubborn human being who refused to leave when things went wrong. Maria Whitfield was exactly that kind of person. She had been born on this land, the daughter of Thomas Whitfield, who had staked his claim along Copper Creek in 1871 and spent 11 years building something real out of dust and determination. When he died of a fever the previous autumn, he had left Maria the deed to 320 acres, good land, creek-watered, with a small silver vein running along the northern ridge that had barely been touched. She was 24 years old and she was alone, and for a while that had been all right because she had the deed locked in the strongbox and the land under her feet and the knowledge that it was hers. Now the deed was gone. She stepped inside and looked at everything with careful eyes. The strongbox had not been broken open. It had been opened with a key, which meant someone had known where the spare key was hidden, under the loose hearthstone. The rest of the house was undisturbed. Nothing else had been taken. This was not a robbery. This was something deliberate and specific, aimed only at her claim. She knew immediately who had done it. Randall Holt was the kind of man who had come to New Mexico not to build something but to take what others had built. He was 43 years old, heavy-jowled and smooth-voiced, and he ran a land acquisition office out of the town of Pale Ridge, which was 12 miles east of Copper Creek. He had been visiting Maria's father in the months before Thomas died, always arriving with a bottle of good whiskey and a sheaf of papers, always talking about the value of the silver vein and how hard it was for a single man in failing health to protect his interests. Thomas Whitfield had not trusted him, and he had told Maria so. But Thomas had also, in his final weeks, been confused and frightened, and Maria had been too consumed with nursing him to watch every conversation closely enough. She had found a paper among her father's things after his death, a paper she had not been able to fully understand, written in legal language that twisted itself into knots. She had taken it to Judge Abernathy in Pale Ridge, and he had looked at it with careful eyes and told her it was nothing to worry about, just a preliminary interest letter that held no legal weight without a corresponding deed transfer. She had been relieved. She had gone home and locked the deed in the strongbox and tried to move forward. And now the deed was gone, and Randall Holt would have it, and he would file it with the land office in Santa Fe and claim that her father had transferred the property before his death, and she would lose everything before the summer was out. Maria Whitfield sat down at her kitchen table, put her hands flat on the surface, and thought for a long time. She had two options. She could go to the sheriff in Pale Ridge, a man named Cutter who had Randall Holt's hand in his back pocket and would smile at her and do nothing, or she could find someone who would actually help her. The problem was that she did not know who that someone might be. She had neighbors, of course, the Brennan family to the south, the widow Casola to the west, but none of them had the kind of reach or authority that could take on a man like Randall Holt. She needed someone who could move through the hard country between Copper Creek and wherever Holt might have gone, someone who understood how men like Holt operated and was not afraid of the trouble that would come with confronting one. It was old Ben Casola, the widow's son, who mentioned Andrew Graves. Ben was 19, sun-darkened and earnest, and he came to Maria's door the morning after she had discovered the theft because word traveled fast in the Copper Creek Valley, and he had heard she was in trouble. He sat at her table and drank her coffee and told her what he knew, which was not much, but enough. "There is a man works out of Cimarron, does tracking and recovery work," Ben said. My uncle hired him 2 years back when someone ran off with 3 horses and a saddle that had been in the family since the war. He got everything back. Charges fair, I think, from what my uncle said. Name is Andrew Graves. A bounty hunter, Maria said. Not exactly. My uncle said he does not hunt men for the reward money. He helps people who have had things taken from them and have nowhere else to turn. Does not work for the law, works for whoever asks him. Ben paused. He is supposed to be very good at it. Maria considered this for a moment. Do you know where to find him in Cimarron? My uncle said he keeps a room at the Cimarron House, the hotel on the main road. When he is not out on a job, he is there. Cimarron was 40 miles north, a hard day's ride through country that was not always friendly. But Maria Whitfield had been riding since she was 5 years old, and she knew every inch of the territory between her front porch and the Canadian River, and she was not the kind of woman who waited for trouble to solve itself. She left the next morning before the sun was fully over the mountains, riding her father's bay gelding, Copper, with a bedroll and provisions enough for 2 days strapped behind the saddle. The sky was enormous and pale above her, streaked with the pink and gold of early morning, and the land was just beginning to show the green that came with spring, the grass coming up new and fine along the creek banks, the cottonwoods budding out, the red earth turned dark and rich where the recent rains had soaked in. She let herself feel the beauty of it for a moment, because she needed to remember what she was riding towards Cimarron to protect. Then she put her heels to Copper's sides and rode. She reached Cimarron in the late afternoon of the following day, having stopped overnight at a station on the Springer Road, where a family named Garfield kept a way house for travelers. The town was everything that Pale Ridge was not, loud and alive and sprawling, with the kind of energy that came from being on the edge of the open range. The Cimarron house was on the main road, as Ben had said, a solid 2-story building with a wide front porch where 2 old men sat playing cards in the lowering light. Maria tied Copper at the rail, patted his neck, and went inside. The man at the desk was thin and spectacled, and he looked at her with polite curiosity when she asked for Andrew Graves. He came in yesterday evening, the man said. Room 8, top of the stairs, but I should tell you, ma'am, he is not always available to new clients right away. He may want to think on it before agreeing. I understand, Maria said. I appreciate the warning. She climbed the stairs and knocked on the door marked 8. There was a pause, and then the sound of someone moving inside, and then the door opened, and she saw him for the first time. Andrew Graves was 30 years old, lean and tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered oak, a deep, complicated brown that seemed to hold more light than it let go. He had a day's worth of stubble on his jaw, and he was in his shirt sleeves, a book open in one hand, and he looked at her with the kind of steady, assessing attention that was not rude but was very direct. Miss, he said. My name is Maria Whitfield, she said. I have come from Copper Creek and I need your help. I was told you are the right person to ask. He studied her for a moment, not the way men sometimes looked at her, which was only a catalogue of surfaces, but in a way that seemed to be reading something in her face, something about what she had already been through and what it had cost her. Come in, he said, and stepped back from the door. She sat in the chair by the window and he sat on the edge of the bed with his book set aside, and she told him everything. The deed, the strongbox, Randall Holt, the paper her father had signed, Judge Abernathy's opinion, all of it. She told it clearly and without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to speak when the situation required it. When she was done, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Andrew Graves was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the floor, which meant he was thinking, not dismissing her. This paper your father signed, he said finally. Do you remember any of the language in it? I do not remember it word for word, she said. But it used the phrase preliminary conveyance with conditions subsequent. Judge Abernathy said those conditions had never been met, and so the paper was void. Did you keep a copy of it? No, I did not think I needed to. He nodded. Judge Abernathy, he said, in Pale Ridge. Yes, he is Holt's brother-in-law, Andrew said. Maria felt the cold stone settle deeper in her chest. I did not know that. Most people do not. Holt keeps his family connections quiet when they are useful to him. He looked up at her then, and she saw something in those oak-brown eyes that was neither pity nor calculation. It was something closer to anger on her behalf, quiet and controlled. The land office in Santa Fe will be where he tries to file the deed transfer. He will want to do it before you can mount any kind of legal challenge. That means he is likely already on his way there, or he has sent someone. How long do I have? Depends on when he took the deed. You said you found the strongbox open 2 days ago. Yes. Then he has a 2-day head start, maybe a bit more. He was quiet again, and then he said, I know a faster route to Santa Fe than the wagon road, and I know Randall Holt's name not personally but by reputation. He has done this before to other people with smaller claims and less resolve than yours. Will you help me? Maria asked. She said it plainly without pleading, because she did not think pleading would work with this man, and also because she did not have it in her to do it. Andrew Graves looked at her steadily. Yes, he said, I will help you. They agreed on terms briefly. She would pay him what she could from the savings she had kept in a different, better hidden place, and if the claim was successfully recovered, they would discuss the rest. He did not press her on the payment. He simply said it was fair and that he would be ready to ride at first light. Maria went downstairs and arranged for a room of her own, and she ate a quiet supper in the hotel dining room and thought about Andrew Graves and the way he had said yes without hesitation, as though the answer had been obvious from the moment she began to speak. She was not accustomed to that kind of directness being turned in her direction. Most people in the valley treated her with a mixture of sympathy and patronizing concern since her father's death, as though she were an obstacle waiting to be moved rather than a person who intended to stay exactly where she was. Andrew Graves had looked at her and seen someone capable of riding 40 miles alone and stating her case clearly and waiting for an answer without falling apart, and he had responded to that rather than to the difficulty of the situation. She fell asleep quickly, which surprised her, and she did not dream. In the morning they rode south out of Cimarron while the stars were still visible at the horizon's edge, the horses moving easily through the cool air. Andrew rode a gray horse named Slate, a big animal with a working disposition and steady feet on the rough ground. He rode the way men who had spent their whole lives on horseback rode, without thought, as naturally as breathing, and Maria found herself matching his pace without trying to. They did not talk much in those first hours. There was an understanding between them that this was the part of the journey that required attention rather than conversation, navigating the switchback trails and rocky washes that Andrew had mentioned. He knew the country well. He knew where the soft ground was after the recent rains, and where the old crossing of the Rayado Creek ran shallow enough to ford without losing time. Maria noticed these things with appreciation, but did not comment on them. Around mid-morning, when they stopped to water the horses at a spring, Andrew told her something more about Randall Holt. He does this through the land courts, Andrew said, hunkering down beside the spring while Slate drank. He finds properties with questionable ownership, deaths in the family, disputed wills, anything that creates a window of vulnerability, and he gets someone to sign something, whether they understand what they are signing or not. Then he files in Santa Fe, and by the time the original owners realize what has happened, the filing is done and it takes years of legal work to undo it. If it can be undone at all, Maria said. Sometimes it cannot. He looked up at her. But in your case the deed was taken, not transferred voluntarily. That is theft, and if we can prove it was in your possession and is now in his, that changes everything. The land office in Santa Fe will not simply accept a deed that was reported stolen. I have not reported it stolen, Maria said. I did not think there was anyone to report it to who would take me seriously. You can make a report at the land office directly when we get there, he said. You do not need the sheriff for that. The land office is federal, not local. Holt does not own anyone there. This was the first time Maria felt something other than cold dread about the situation. It was not hope exactly. It was more like the feeling of ground solidifying under her feet after walking on ice. They pushed hard through the middle of the day, making good time on the higher trails that bypassed the worst of the road traffic. By afternoon, they were dropping into the lower country, and the heat rose around them in visible waves, and Maria was grateful for the hat she had thought to bring, and the canteen she kept refreshed. Andrew Graves was not a man who talked about himself easily, but she found that, when she asked him direct questions, he answered them without deflection, which she respected. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, on a ranch outside Amarillo, the second of 3 brothers. She learned that he had come to New Mexico territory 8 years ago, initially to work cattle drives, and had ended up doing his current work after helping a widow named Pierce recover a piece of land that a crooked county clerk had tried to file away from her. He had been 22 at the time and had thought of it simply as the right thing to do, but word had gotten around and more people had come to him, and over the years it had become what he did. "Do you enjoy it?" Maria asked. He thought about the question seriously before answering. "I enjoy when it works out right," he said. "When someone gets back what should never have been taken, that part I enjoy. The traveling and the hard riding I am neutral about. Some days it is fine, some days it is very long." "Do you have somewhere you think of as home?" she asked. The question was more personal than she had intended, but she did not take it back. He looked at her sideways as they rode. "Not really," he said. "Not yet." There was something in the not yet that she noticed but did not pursue. They camped that night beside the Rio Mora, where the cottonwoods were full and the sound of the water was constant and easy. Andrew built a small fire and made coffee, and they ate what they had packed without ceremony. The stars over New Mexico in the spring of 1882 were extraordinary. The sky swept clean by the altitude. The Milky Way laid across it like flour dusted over dark cloth. Maria watched the sky and thought about her father and the land and the spring evenings when he had sat on the porch with her after supper and told her the names of the stars that he knew. She felt the grief of his loss as a steady ache that she had gotten somewhat used to, like a mended bone that still complained in cold weather. "Tell me something about the land," Andrew said. He was sitting across the fire from her, his hat pushed back on his head, his coffee cup held loosely in both hands. "What kind of something?" "Whatever you want me to know about it. The thing about it that matters most to you." She thought for a moment. "In the morning when the sun comes over the eastern mountains, it hits the creek at an angle that makes the water look like hammered copper," she said. "That is why my father called it Copper Creek, even though everyone assumed it was because of the ore. He used to say the water was worth more than anything in the ground. He said water was the most honest thing in the West because it just went where it wanted and did not pretend otherwise." Andrew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," Maria said. "He was the best man I have ever known." She paused. "Until possibly recently," she added, and then wished she had not said it because it sounded forward. But Andrew Graves did not look embarrassed. He looked at her in the firelight with those steady brown eyes, and something in his expression shifted very slightly, like a window opening in a room that had been closed for too long. "I have not done anything worth comparing to that yet," he said. "You are riding 40 miles on short notice to chase down a man who stole from a woman you did not know 3 days ago," she said. "That counts for something." He looked back at the fire. "It counts for a start," he said. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe by mid-afternoon of the second day on the road. The city sprawled against the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the warm adobe light that was particular to that country, buildings the color of earth, the smell of piñon smoke on the air, the plaza busy with the particular mix of people that Santa Fe had always drawn. Anglo settlers and old Spanish families and traders and government men and people who did not fit neatly into any category. Andrew led them directly to the Federal Land Office on the southeast corner of the plaza, a solid adobe building with territorial government insignia on the door. He had been here before. He moved through the city with the ease of someone who had navigated it under pressure. Inside, a clerk named Dunbar received them. He was a careful, methodical man of 50 who listened to Maria's account with the kind of attention that came from knowing his job had real consequences for real people. Andrew did most of the speaking, setting out the situation with clear, concise language, and Maria confirmed the details and answered questions about dates and her father's death and the circumstances of the deed. Dunbar checked his intake records. No deed transfer has been filed for the Whitfield property on Copper Creek, he said. Not yet. But if someone is coming with one, they may file it as early as tomorrow morning if they arrived in the city today. Can she register a complaint of theft against the deed itself? Andrew asked. She can, and I would recommend it, Dunbar said. If you file a formal objection today, noting that the deed was removed from your possession without your consent, and that any transfer document was obtained by fraud or theft, I can flag that property in our records. Any subsequent filing will be held in suspension pending investigation. It will not stop someone from trying to file, but it will stop the transfer from going through automatically. How long does the investigation take? Maria asked. Weeks, potentially months. But the important thing is that your claim is protected during that period. You retain possession of the land. Nothing can be transferred while the investigation flag is active. They spent the better part of 2 hours in the land office, filling out the complaint and the objection documents, with Dunbar walking them through every section with the careful thoroughness of a man who took the weight of the papers he processed seriously. Maria signed her name 7 times in the careful penmanship her father had made her practice every evening for years, and each signature felt like driving a stake into the ground. When they emerged from the land office into the warm plaza afternoon, Maria stood for a moment in the sunlight and let out a breath she had been holding for 3 days. That handles the legal protection, Andrew said, but Holt still has the original deed, and if we want to make sure this is fully resolved, we need it back. Can you find him? She asked. He came to Santa Fe with the deed, which means he is here or close by, Andrew said. A man like Holt does not do this kind of business himself unless he is confident, and he has to be in the city to file the papers. He will not have come alone. He will have an attorney with him, likely someone who works the land fraud cases and knows how to present the documents without raising immediate questions. That attorney will be staying somewhere specific. You know who his attorney is? I know 2 attorneys in Santa Fe who handle work like Holt's regularly, Andrew said. Their names are Penrose and Glassett. If Holt is here, he is with one of them. Andrew knew Santa Fe well enough to know where men of business stayed. He left Maria at the La Fonda Hotel, where he had taken them 2 rooms, with firm instructions to rest and eat, and he went out alone into the city to listen and look. He was back within 2 hours. He knocked at her door, and when she opened it, he said quietly, "Holt is at the Sundown Hotel on College Street. He arrived yesterday evening with a man named Penrose. They have a meeting with a land office representative in the morning, but not Dunbar. One of the other clerks, a man named Sayers, who has processed some questionable filings in the past." "How did you find that out?" "I bought a man a drink," Andrew said simply. Maria almost smiled. "And now?" "Now we need to recover the deed before morning," he said, "which means talking to Holt directly." He paused. "I want you to understand what that conversation is going to look like. It will not be pleasant. Holt is not going to hand over something he thinks is worth a great deal of money simply because we ask nicely." "I did not imagine he would," Maria said. "What is your plan?" Andrew came inside and sat down and laid it out for her. It was not complicated, which was the thing about Andrew Graves that Maria would come to understand more fully over time. He had a gift for seeing the simple line through a complex situation. Holt had the deed, but he did not yet know that Maria had filed a formal objection with the land office. He believed he held all the cards. The moment he learned that his filing would be flagged and investigated rather than automatically processed, the deed became much less valuable to him. It would simply be evidence of his own crime. If he understands that we can prove the deed was stolen and that the land office will not process his transfer, and that we will take the matter to the federal marshal's office unless he returns the deed tonight, he may choose to cut his losses, Andrew said. And if he does not, then we go to the federal marshal's office anyway tonight, and we let the law handle it from there. But the complaint at the land office is solid, Maria. Your claim is protected either way. What we are trying to do now is recover the original deed so that there is no legal ambiguity going forward. She noticed that he had used her given name, and she noticed that she did not mind it at all. They went to the Sundown Hotel at 7 in the evening, when the light was still long and gold through the windows. Andrew asked at the desk for Mr. Holt and gave a name that was not his own, and the desk clerk sent a boy upstairs to fetch him. Randall Holt came down looking confident and well-fed, a man who had spent his life arriving in rooms and immediately beginning to calculate his advantages. He was heavy in the shoulders with a wide, pale face and eyes that moved quickly over everything. When he saw Maria, those eyes stopped moving. The confidence did not fall away from his face. It reorganized itself into something else, a careful, watchful stillness. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "this is a surprise." "I do not imagine it is as much of a surprise as you would like me to think," Maria said. Andrew stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, but in a way that ensured Holt's eyes moved to him. "My name is Graves," Andrew said. "I would suggest we step somewhere private. The matter we need to discuss is not one you want the lobby to hear." Holt looked at Andrew with the measuring calculation of a man who was used to reading other men quickly and accurately, and what he read in Andrew Graves made him decide, after only a brief pause, to lead them to a small sitting room off the main lobby. The conversation that followed was not loud, and it was not long. Andrew stated the situation in the same clear, unemotional way he had spoken to Dunbar at the land office. He named the formal objection that had been filed. He named the flag on the property. He named the federal jurisdiction. He told Holt that the clerk named Sayers would not be able to help him now, and that the deed in his possession was, legally speaking, a stolen document. Holt listened to all of this with his hands folded on his knee and his expression very controlled. "You are making a serious accusation," Holt said. "Miss Whitfield is making a formal report of theft," Andrew said. "The accusation is already made and recorded. The question before you now is whether you want to return the deed tonight and save yourself a federal investigation, or whether you want to wait until morning and find out what happens when you try to file documents that are flagged as potentially fraudulent." The silence in the room was complete for a moment. Maria watched Holt and did not look away. She thought about her father sitting on the porch in the evening and the way the creek water looked in morning light, and she kept her face calm with the effort of someone who has decided that being calm is the most powerful thing she can do. Holt reached into his coat. For one heart-stopping moment, Maria thought he was reaching for a weapon. But he produced a folded document, thick paper, handled carefully, and held it out with the deliberate gesture of a man who wants it understood that he is choosing to concede rather than being forced to. "I want a written statement that this ends the matter," Holt said. "The matter of the deed transfer ends," Andrew said. "Miss Whitfield's formal theft report with the land office is a separate matter, and she will decide independently what to pursue there." Holt's eyes moved to Maria. "Miss Whitfield." "Give me the deed, Mr. Holt," she said. He handed it to her. She unfolded it with careful hands and read through it her father's original deed, the property description that she knew by heart, the signatures of the territorial witnesses, all of it intact and present. Her father's handwriting at the bottom, the large T and the careful W that he had practiced until they were exactly how he wanted them. She folded it again and held it against her chest for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she was not thanking Holt. They left the Sundown Hotel and walked through the warm Santa Fe evening to the plaza, where the Essequia ran in its old stone channel and the cottonwoods rustled in the evening air, and Maria held the deed in both hands and felt the relief moving through her like the first warm rain of spring. Andrew walked beside her, close but not pressing, and for a few moments neither of them said anything. The sounds of the city wrapped around them, voices from open doorways, the distant sound of a fiddle from one of the saloons on the east side of the plaza, the soft rhythm of the water in the acequia. "It is over," Maria said. It came out quietly, as though she were testing whether the words were true. "The deed is recovered," Andrew said. "You should take it to Dunbar in the morning, have him verify it, and have your formal objection updated with a note that the document has been returned. That closes the loop on the legal side. And Holt," Andrew was quiet for a moment, "he will be careful about this particular property going forward. A man like Holt moves to easier targets when one becomes too complicated. But you should be aware that the formal complaint at the land office will remain on record, and if he pursues any similar actions against other landowners, the record of this incident will be part of the evidence against him." "I want him held accountable," Maria said, "not just warned off." "I know," Andrew said, "and you have done the right things to make that possible. The rest depends on the federal marshal's office and how much attention they choose to give to land fraud in this territory." He paused. "I can make sure the report gets to the right person there, someone I know. It will not happen overnight, but I do not think Randall Holt's practices will be overlooked forever." She believed him. There was something about the way he said things that made you believe them, not because he was persuasive exactly, but because he said only what he was sure of and nothing more. They returned to La Fonda, and Maria ate a full supper for the first time in days and slept deeply and without dreams. In the morning, they went back to the land office and completed the final documentation with Dunbar, who examined the deed carefully and confirmed it was the legitimate original and made a notation in the official record that it had been returned to the rightful owner and that the objection was resolved in Maria Whitfield's favor. He shook her hand with both of his when they were done and told her she had been very shrewd in how she had handled the situation. "It was not entirely me," Maria said. "No," Dunbar agreed, glancing at Andrew. "But you knew who to ask." They rode out of Santa Fe in the early afternoon, heading north and west, back the way they had come. The mountains were brilliant in the spring light, and the air smelled of sage and pine and the particular dry sweetness that belonged to the New Mexico high country. Maria rode with the deed tucked safe inside her coat, against her heart. The return journey was different from the ride to Santa Fe. The urgency was gone, and in its place was something that expanded naturally into the space urgency had occupied conversation and silence, and the slow incremental knowledge of another person that comes when you have been through something difficult together and come out the other side of it. Andrew told her about a place he had once spent a winter in Colorado, a town called Elizabethtown that had gone from boom to bust in the space of 2 years, and how he had watched people rebuild after the mining played out, how some of them had stayed and made something of the land itself when the ore was gone. He told her about a woman named Mrs. Flores who had run the boarding house there and made the best postle he had ever tasted, and who had told him once that a man who traveled without roots would eventually stop being interested in the journey. "Did you think she was right?" Maria asked. "I did not at the time," Andrew said. "I am reconsidering." She told him about growing up on the Copper Creek land, the way the seasons changed, the cattle her father had run in the early years before the silver was found, the winters that were hard and the springs that made up for them entirely. She told him about learning to mend fence at 10 years old and to shoe a horse at 12, and to read a land deed at 15, because her father had believed that knowing the language of ownership was as important as any other survival skill in the West. "He sounds like he prepared you for exactly this," Andrew said. "He did," Maria said. "He just could not prepare me for the part where I would have to do it alone." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "You are not entirely alone," he said. It was a simple thing to say, but it landed somewhere specific and warm in her chest, and she let it stay there. They camped again on the second night at the Rio Mora crossing, the same spot as before, and the fire was warm and the sky above the cottonwoods was full of stars. They were more comfortable with each other now, and the silence between them when it came was the easy kind rather than the careful kind. "I want to ask you something," Maria said. They were sitting on opposite sides of the fire as before, but the distance felt smaller. "Ask," he said. "When we get back to Copper Creek and this is finished," she said, "what will you do next?" He looked at the fire for a moment. "Another job, most likely. Someone else who has had something taken from them." He paused. "There is no shortage of that kind of work." "Does it bother you," she said, "never staying in one place?" He looked up at her. In the firelight his face was all warm shadow and sharp angles and those steady eyes that she had come to think of as one of the most honest things she had ever seen. "It has not bothered me the way it might," he said, "but I think that is because I have not had a good reason to stop." "And if you had a reason," she said. The question hung between them in the night air, alongside the sound of the water and the breathing of the horses and the pop of the fire. Maria held his gaze and did not look away because she was not the kind of person who asked a question and then retreated from it. Andrew Graves set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, as though he were holding something very delicate and trying to figure out the right way to put it down without breaking it. "I think I would stay," he said, "if the reason was the right one." She nodded slowly. The warmth in her chest had spread to her hands, and she was grateful for it because the night air was cool. They sat for a long time after that without needing to say anything else. They reached Copper Creek on the afternoon of the third day of the return journey, coming down out of the higher country on the switchback trail that Maria had ridden 100 times and could have navigated in her sleep. The valley opened out below them in the long spring light, and there was the creek winding through the cottonwoods, and there was the house with the white fence her father had painted 2 years ago, and there were the mountains to the east with their silver bones. Maria pulled Copper to a stop at the top of the trail and looked at it for a moment without moving. Andrew stopped beside her. "That is what you fought for," he said. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." She rode down to the house and put Copper in the barn and found that her neighbor Mrs. Brennan had, without being asked, been keeping an eye on the place and had left a covered dish of food on the kitchen table with a note that said simply, "We heard you went a fight for it. Welcome home." Maria sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread open before her and the dish of food pushed to one side, and she put her face in her hands for just a moment. Not crying exactly, but allowing something to release that had been held very tightly for a very long time. When she lifted her face, Andrew was standing in the doorway. He had taken care of the horses and his hat was in his hands, and he was looking at her with an expression that was so purely concerned and so entirely without any expectation of anything from her that she felt it the way you feel certain pieces of music as a physical thing. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I am very much all right." She looked at the deed and then at him. "Come and sit down. I have something to ask you." He came inside and sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where she had told Ben Casola she would go to Cimarron, the table where she had sat alone for the better part of a year trying to figure out how to move forward. Andrew Graves sat in that space as though he had always belonged somewhere near it, hat in his lap, watching her with his full, unhurried attention. "You said last night," Maria said, "that if you had the right reason you would stay in a place." "I did say that," Andrew said. "I am not trying to pressure you into something," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. But I also do not believe in circling around what I actually mean, because my father raised me to say what I meant, and I think it is generally better practice." She paused. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, and I think what happened between us these past several days has been the beginning of something, and I would rather know whether you feel the same way than not ask and spend the next year wondering." Andrew Graves was quiet for a long moment, and he was looking at her with an expression that was so specific and so certain that the answer was already evident before he said a word. "What I want in return," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very deliberate, "for going after Holt and getting the deed back, is the chance to keep knowing you. That is all I want. I did not do it for payment or for any other reason. I did it because someone who did not know me trusted me with something that mattered to them completely, and that is not something I take lightly." He paused. "And because from the moment you stood in that doorway in Cimarron and told me your situation without flinching, I could not think of anyone I would rather ride 100 miles with." Maria was quiet for just a moment. Then she said, "That seems like a very reasonable thing to want." "I am a reasonable man," Andrew said, and something in his voice shifted just slightly into warmth, and then she smiled, and it was the first time she had fully smiled in longer than she could easily remember, and the smile she gave him was completely without restraint. He stayed. Not in the way of a man who had decided to impose himself, but in the way of a man who had found, somewhat unexpectedly, that the thing he had not known he was looking for had been waiting in a creek valley in New Mexico territory all along. He helped Maria repair the fence on the north side of the property that had come down in a spring storm. He helped her haul water from the creek during the stretch of days when the wind blew too dry and too long. He was useful and present without being overbearing, and Maria found that having him near was like having sunlight in a room. You did not realize how good it was until it had been there long enough to feel ordinary. They worked the land together through that spring and into early summer, and in the working of it they learned each other's rhythms. When the other needed silence and when they needed company, when to push and when to wait, when to speak, and when a look between them was enough. There were evenings on the porch where they talked until the stars were fully out, about everything, about what Maria wanted to do with the northern ridge where the silver vein ran, about the future of cattle versus silver in the territory, about the people Andrew had helped over the years and what had become of them, about books they had both read and had opinions about. Maria had more books than Andrew had expected, and Andrew had more opinions about them than Maria had anticipated, and the combination was very satisfying. There was a particular evening in late May when they were sitting on the porch after supper, and the air was cool and sweet, and the creek was running loud after a recent rain, and Andrew reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything about it at all, as though this were the most natural thing in the world and had always been inevitable. After that, they stopped being careful about what they were to each other. In June, Andrew rode to Cimarron to settle some business, to tell the people who sent him work that he was going to be less available for a while, and to collect what remained of his belongings from the room at the Cimarron house. He was gone for 4 days, and Maria found, to her own interest, that the house felt much too quiet without him. When he came back, riding up the valley road in the late afternoon with Slate moving easily under him, and his coat dusty from the road, and his hat pushed back from his face the way he wore it when he was relaxed and comfortable, she came out to the gate to meet him. He swung down from Slate and looked at her for a moment and then walked toward her, and when he reached her he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her, which was the first time they had done that, and it was the kind of kiss that answered several questions at once. "I brought something," he said when they separated, and he went back to Slate's saddlebag and produced a small wrapped package that turned out to contain a book of Mary Shelley and a small paper bag of peppermint candies that were a particular thing that Cimarron got from a trader who came through from Colorado, and a letter he had written out by hand that said, in his very neat, deliberate handwriting, that he intended to stay in this valley for the rest of his natural life if she would have him. She read the letter twice. "Is there a question somewhere in here?" she said. "There is a question in the last line," he said. "The last line read, 'Will you let me make this home?'" "Yes," Maria said. "Consider yourself asked and answered." He smiled, and it was the particular smile she had come to understand as the one he kept for moments he actually meant, not the polite working smile, but the real one, the one that reached all the way to those oak-brown eyes and made them warmer than usual. They were married in September of 1882 in the Copper Creek Valley, under the cottonwoods by the creek. It was a small ceremony with the Brennan family and the widow Casola and young Ben, and a few others from the valley who had become part of the community Maria and Andrew were building around the property. A minister named Hadley came out from Pale Ridge, not the same minister who had any connection to Holt's Circle, but a newer man who had arrived in the territory that summer and who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and very appropriate brevity. Maria wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in a cedar chest since childhood, and it fit her well, and Andrew wore the good coat he had retrieved from Cimarron that he almost never wore otherwise, and they stood under the cottonwoods in the September light with the sound of the creek behind them, and said the words to each other as though they meant every single one of them, because they did. Afterwards there was a supper that the women of the valley contributed to collectively, and a fiddle player Mrs. Brennan had somehow arranged, and dancing on the flat ground beside the house, and the September evening was warm and the stars came out early and sharp, and everything was exactly as it should be. At some point during the dancing, when Maria was between partners and catching her breath, old Mrs. Casola came to stand beside her and said, "Your father would have liked him very much." Maria looked at Andrew, who was talking with two of the Brennan men about something that had them all laughing, and she felt the old grief and the new joy existing together in the same place without canceling each other out, which was one of the more remarkable things about being human, she thought. Yes, she said, he would have. The formal matter of Randall Holt did not simply dissolve, as Andrew had promised Maria it would not. In October of that year, a federal marshal named Crowder came to Copper Creek to take her full statement about the deed theft, and Andrew provided his own account of the recovery. Marshal Crowder was a serious man who had been looking at land fraud in the territory for some time, and who understood immediately that Maria's case was one piece of a larger pattern. Randall Holt was formally investigated by the federal marshal's office in November of 1882. The investigation uncovered 4 other cases of deed manipulation, similar to what had been done to Maria III, in which other landowners had signed documents they did not fully understand, and one that had gone as far as an illegal transfer that was ultimately reversed at significant legal cost to the original owner. Holt was brought before a federal judge in Santa Fe in the spring of 1883 and convicted of fraud and theft, and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. Judge Abernathy in Pale Ridge, his brother-in-law, was investigated for his role in providing misleading legal advice and removed from the bench. Maria heard the verdict in a letter from Marshal Crowder and read it aloud to Andrew at the kitchen table, and when she finished she folded it and set it down and said, simply, "Good." Andrew put his hand over hers on the table. "Good," he agreed. The work of the land continued and deepened. Andrew turned out to have strong opinions about cattle management and a quiet gift for the practical work of ranching. And through the winter of 1882 and into the following spring, they made decisions together about what to do with the Whitfield property. The silver vein on the northern ridge was sold as a mining lease to a Denver company in the spring of 1883, which provided enough capital to expand the cattle operation significantly and repair the main barn, and add a proper horse run on the east side of the property. By the summer of 1883, they had 12 head of cattle, 4 good horses, a working vegetable garden that was Maria's particular pride, and a life that had the full and solid feeling of something built to last. Maria found out she was expecting their first child in August of 1883, and she told Andrew on a Sunday morning when they were sitting at the breakfast table with the windows open and the summer air moving through the house. She told him plainly, the way she did things, and watched the expression on his face move through surprise and then something so entirely open and overwhelmed and happy that it was almost more than she knew how to look at. He came around the table and held her face in both hands the same way he had the day he came back from Cimarron, and he pressed his forehead to hers and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "I did not know I could be this glad." Their son was born in the early spring of 1884, on a cold and brilliant March morning when the eastern mountains were still holding snow and the creek was running high with snowmelt. He came into the world with considerable emphasis and made his opinions known immediately, which Maria said was probably Andrew's doing and Andrew said was probably hers. They named him Thomas James Graves Thomas for Maria's father, James for Andrew's father, who had been a steady and good man on the Texas ranch outside Amarillo, and who Andrew still missed in the particular way that men miss fathers who have been worth missing. Thomas was a solid, dark-haired, good-tempered child who took to the land from the moment he was old enough to be taken outdoors, which Maria and Andrew did with great regularity, carrying him across the property in his early months, and then, when he was older and walking, letting him go where he wanted within the safe perimeter of the fence. He was 2 years old when Maria found out she was expecting again. This time she told Andrew in the evening on the porch, the way she told him important things sitting together with the last of the day's light going out over the mountains. He took her hand and held it and said, "We are going to need more fence." She laughed, which was one of the things Andrew Graves was best at producing in her genuine laughter, the kind that came from the center of her. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1887, and they named her Clara after Andrew's mother. She arrived in a gentler manner than her brother, and was from the beginning a more reflective child, watching the world with large dark eyes and a steadiness that seemed remarkable in someone so small. Ben Casola, who had by this time grown into a fully capable young man managing his mother's property next door and beginning to court a girl from the Springer Road named Annette Garfield, was Clara's godfather and took the role with a seriousness that was touching. He had never quite gotten over the sense that he had played a small part in how everything had worked out. It was, after all, his mentioning of Andrew Graves's name that had started the whole chain, and he treated his connection to the Graves family with the particular pride of someone who has done one right thing and knows it. Old Mrs. Casola, who had been in uncertain health for the past several years, improved remarkably in the spring of 1887, which she attributed to the unusually warm weather and Andrew's repairs to her chimney, which had been drawing badly for years and filling her house with smoke that everyone now realized had been contributing significantly to her coughing. Andrew fixed the chimney in an afternoon with the matter-of-fact efficiency that he brought to everything practical. The property on Copper Creek continued to develop. By 1888, 6 years after Maria had ridden 40 miles alone to find a stranger in a hotel room in Cimarron and ask for his help, the Graves Ranch, as the valley had come to think of it, though Maria was clear that it was still and always the Whitfield Graves property, had grown to a working cattle and horse operation that employed 2 men year-round and a third during the busy seasons. The main house had been expanded with a proper wing that gave Thomas and Clara their own rooms, and the front porch had been extended and given a new railing that Andrew had made himself over the winter from local timber, fitting the pieces together with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. On an evening in the early autumn of 1888, with the harvest done and the cattle settled for the coming winter and the children asleep inside, Maria and Andrew sat on the new porch in the cooling air and looked out over the creek valley. The mountains to the east were going from gold to purple in the last light, and the cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow, and the sound of the water was the same sound it had always been, constant and easy and honest, just like her father had always said. Andrew was quiet in the comfortable way that had become one of the things Maria loved most about being with him, the ability to sit in silence with a person and have it feel like a full thing rather than an empty one. She turned to look at him in the fading light. His hair had some gray at the temples now, which she had told him was distinguished, and which he had told her she was kind to say. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper. He was more himself than he had ever been, which was the way time worked on people who were spending it right. "I was thinking about that evening in Cimarron," Maria said. "What were you thinking about it?" he said. "I was thinking about what I must have looked like," she said. "Riding up alone, going to a stranger's hotel room, asking for help with something that probably sounded like a very long way to ride for an uncertain outcome. You looked like someone who knew exactly what she wanted and what she was willing to do to get it," Andrew said, "which is the most compelling thing I have ever seen in a person." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That made it even more compelling." She shook her head and smiled. "Do you remember what I said to you?" she asked. "When I gave you back the deed in Santa Fe after Holt handed it over, I asked you what you wanted in return." "I remember," he said, "and you said you wanted the chance to keep knowing me." "I did say that." "Was it worth it?" she said. "What you asked for?" Andrew Graves turned to look at her fully, in the last warm light of the September evening, and the expression on his face was so complete and so entirely certain that it would have answered the question even without words. "Maria," he said, "every single morning I wake up in this house, with those mountains out the window and that creek running and our children asleep down the hall and you beside me, and I think about the fact that it came from saying yes to one question from a woman I had never met, and I think it might be the best exchange I have ever made in my life." She reached across and took his hand the way she had first taken it on the porch years ago, turning it over in hers and holding it in both of her own. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I rode 40 miles to Cimarron because I had no other option," she said. "That was true. But from the moment you opened that door and I saw your face, I knew I had made the right decision, and I want you to know that. I knew before you said yes, before we rode a single mile together, before anything happened, I knew that whoever you were someone I could trust completely, and that turned out to be true in every single way." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see that he was holding the weight of it, the way he always did when something mattered. "Thank you for that," he said. And then, because he was Andrew, and because some things were better done than said, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed them to her knuckles, and the warmth of it moved through her the way it always had, immediate and specific and entirely his. The stars came out over the Copper Creek Valley, the same stars that had been out there the night Maria's father had named them for her from the porch, the same stars that had hung over two people camping beside the Rio Mora in the spring of 1882, the same stars that always came out over this particular piece of land and always would. The creek ran in its channel below the cottonwoods. The horses were still in the barn. Somewhere in the house, their son Thomas shifted in his sleep with the restlessness of a 6-year-old who had run hard all day, and their daughter Clara slept the deep, still sleep of small children who have decided the world is safe. Maria Whitfield, Maria Graves, as she was also known, though she kept both names because her father had given her one and her husband had given her the other, and she saw no reason to choose between gifts, sat on the porch of the house her father had built on the land her father had claimed, with the deed locked safe in the iron strongbox inside, and a key known only to her, and Andrew hanging on a nail by the stove. And she thought that sometimes the most extraordinary things began with the simplest questions. She had asked a stranger what he wanted in return for helping her. And everything that had come after, the ride back through the spring mountains, the evenings by the fire, the slow and complete knowing of another person, the children asleep inside, the land around them rich and real and theirs, all of it had been the answer. Through the years that followed, the Graves family became one of the foundational presences in the Copper Creek Valley. They helped Ben Casola when he and Annette married in 1889, and then when their first child arrived the following year. They helped the Brennan family through a difficult winter in 1890, when sickness moved through the valley, and Andrew drove a wagon to Pale Ridge twice in 1 week through bad weather to bring back medicine and supplies. They were the kind of neighbors that people quietly relied on and publicly celebrated, the kind of family that seemed to make the entire surrounding community more solid simply by being present in it. Andrew eventually returned to occasional recovery work. There were cases, over the years, where someone in the valley or the surrounding territory had been wronged in a way that required his particular skills, and he never entirely turned away from that work. But he chose the cases carefully, never taking anything that would keep him from home for more than a week or two at a time, and he turned down far more than he accepted. He had found the thing Mrs. Flores in Elizabethtown had been talking about, the route that the traveling man needed. He had found it in a creek valley in New Mexico territory, and he tended it with the same care he brought to everything that mattered. Thomas Graves grew into a tall, thoughtful young man who had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and who was, by the time he was 12, as capable with horses as anyone in the valley. He would one day take a significant interest in the management of the property, though that was many years away yet, and there was a great deal of growing still to do. Clara Graves was quieter and sharper-edged in her thinking, the child who noticed things others missed, and who had a particular gift for the kind of patient observation that made her very good at understanding what was happening around her before anyone else had noticed. Andrew said, watching her sometimes with enormous pride, that she had her mother's ability to read a room and her own particular version of it. In the spring of 1889, when the cherry trees that Maria had planted along the south fence the year before first came into bloom, pink and fragrant in the cool air, Maria stood at the kitchen window watching them while the morning light came through, and Andrew came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one without being asked. They stood there together in the morning quiet and watched the blossoms move in the light wind. "My father planted a cherry tree once," Maria said. "It died the first winter." "Yours did not die," Andrew said. "No," she said, "they did not." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think that means we have done something right." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I think so too," he said. The deed to the Whitfield Graves property on Copper Creek remained in the iron strongbox by the hearthstone, in perfect order, its ink clear and its pages unsmudged, signed by Thomas Whitfield in the large, careful T, and the deliberate W that his daughter had come to think of as the most important letters in the alphabet. Alongside it, as the years went on, Maria placed other papers: the ranch expansion agreement, the lease on the northern silver vein, the birth registrations for Thomas and Clara, and eventually, in a small envelope, the letter Andrew had written out by hand in Cimarron that asked whether she would let him make this home. She kept that letter because it was, in many ways, the second most important document that had ever been placed in that strongbox. The first was the deed, the thing she had ridden 40 miles to protect, the thing that had brought Andrew Graves into her life. Everything that mattered had begun with that deed, and with that ride, and with a question she had asked a stranger in a Cimarron hotel room. "What do you want in return?" And the stranger had looked at her steadily with those oak-brown eyes and said he wanted the chance to keep knowing her. And she had said yes, and he had stayed, and the cherry trees had not died, and the creek still ran copper bright in the morning light. And that was how it had always been going to be, she thought, not because fate arranged it, but because 2 people had looked at each other clearly and honestly and chosen it, again and again, until the choosing became as natural as breathing and as constant as the water moving over the stones. Outside, the Copper Creek Valley spread out in the long, brilliant light of another New Mexico morning, and the mountains were steady to the east, and the land was exactly what it had always been, real and particular and full of the kind of beauty that required nothing of you except to notice it. Maria Graves noticed it every single day. She was, after all, her father's daughter. And she had learned, over the 6 and 7 and 8 years of this good life they had built together, that the best things did not always announce themselves dramatically. Sometimes the best things came quietly, in the form of a name mentioned by a neighbor's son, a 40-mile ride through spring country, a door opening in a hotel hallway, and a stranger who said yes without hesitation and meant it completely. She turned from the window and set her coffee cup on the table and went to find Andrew, who was in the barn with Thomas, beginning the morning work the way every morning here began, with presence and attention and the satisfaction of a life that was fully and entirely their own. The strongbox sat where it had always sat. The deed was safe inside. The land was theirs. And everything else, all the richness and all the love and all the years still ahead of them, was more than anyone had any right to ask for, and exactly as much as they had earned.